a funny thing happened on the way. I had every intention of completing the play this time, but the road to you-know-where is paved with good intentions. And so it's going to be one more meeting after tonight, because I just got interested in all sorts of things in the 3 scenes or 4 scenes that I looked at. And so we'll go as far as we can go, and we'll hardly deal at all with Shakespeare. We'll be talking about everything under the sun but Shakespeare tonight. Is this? Yeah, we're picking up, all right. We're watching in this play the disintegration of a great republic and a whole way of life, a social and political way of life. We're watching the political class and the conspiracy in that class being broken up. And we're seeing the elite of that class dying either in war or being killed in purges. Families are being destroyed, like the family of Brutus. And in civil war, people in one family are on both sides of the issue. And so families are being torn apart in a lot of ways. As we're seeing in the play, individuals are also coming apart at the seams as their personalities seem to disintegrate under the pressure. It's pretty hard for us to realize the state of society at that time, because the Roman Empire was exceedingly well developed. And after the breakdown of the Roman Empire, it took all the way until the 18th century before there were improvements on the general standard of living, as far as warm baths and eating facilities and clothing and things like that. It took that long before the Renaissance kicked in and brought all sorts of good things like Pop-Tarts and things like that into civilization. And it was really a great society, and it was somewhat similar to ours, except ours has pretensions to being a religious society, whereas Rome didn't make such pretension. There was religion, but not a whole lot, and most of the religion of the society didn't come in until well after this play. So we're watching something really great being torn apart, but Shakespeare focuses on other things. Act 5 opens, the first scene is on the plain of Philippi, which is the battlefield. And Octavius and Antony are discussing how fortunate it is that the enemy has chosen to come and meet them on the open field where they have the advantage, rather than remaining in the hills where they would have, where the conspiracy would have had the advantage. What happens at this point is that the army of Brutus and Cassius, the combined armies, enter, and Cassius and Brutus exchange words, or probably insults is probably better, with Antony and Octavius. Now, this is not just drama. This is very true to life. If you've ever watched the prelude to a World Championship boxing match, or a big thing on TV, wrestling, the same sort of thing actually takes place. If there's a fight on the schoolyard, boys exchange taunts and words before they fight. I'm sure we've all heard it, and the exchange always comes, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. I can remember those from the playground days yet. Some of this is because there's uneasiness and insecurity, but not all of it. Certainly not all of it. Words are the direct expressions of thoughts. And thoughts are at the very beginning of the causal chain. Thoughts instigate desires or motivations, and everything follows after that. So everything actually really does begin in thought. And so what we can see here are minds that know this. They're trying to unnerve the opposition, but at the same time they're also trying to rev up their own desires and raise things up to a very high pitch. As Antony's army arrives, Cassius utters a very remarkable speech at the beginning with the statement of his birthday. Cassius says, "Messala, this is my birthday, as this very day was Cassius born. Give me thy hand, Messala, be thou my witness that against my will, as Pompey was, am I compelled to set upon one battle all our liberties. You know I held Epicurus strong and his opinion. I now change my mind, and partly credit things that do presage, partially credit things that do presage. Coming from Sardis, our former ensign, two mighty eagles fell, and they perched, gorging and feeding from our soldiers' hands, who to Philippi here consorted us. This morning they fled away and gone. They are fled away and gone. And in their steads do ravens, crows, and kites fly o'er our heads and downward look on us as we were sickly prey. Their shadows seem a canopy most fatal, under which our army lies ready to give up the ghost." It's an extremely remarkable speech, especially to even get somebody that materialistic and cynical to say something of that kind is remarkable. And that's what set my thought spinning on a lot of things. The speech, as it is presented in the face of death, is something like a deathbed conversion. Cassius declares that until this moment, he has been a skeptic, a materialist, and a rather selfish one, an Epicurean, and he didn't believe in omens. But when the eagles come in and stay with them until the day of the battle and then leave nothing but ravens, crows, and kites, he changes his mind. Now, death is merely a passage from one realm to another. It's a change of activity from a forward-going, spinning into matter to an unwinding. So it is a very major change, and it is powerful even though it is really just a transition. This is especially the case for a materialist skeptic, because as a materialist skeptic, it's all on the line for Cassius, because death ends it all for him. And so there's a tremendous amount of psychological pressure on him, because he's thinking he may be living his last day forever and ever and ever, and that when the body rots, he's gone, and there will not be anything that continues on. So this is a moment of truth for him. The pressure is mounting, but the pressure is not merely in the external circumstances. He's no longer thinking about what he's going to get out of this if they win the battle. He's thinking about death and his philosophy altogether. So the internal pressure is much, much stronger. And because the internal pressure is as strong as it is, Cassius is undergoing a conversion phenomenon. And a conversion phenomenon, whether you look at it psychologically, or whether you look at it spiritually, or whether you look at it both ways, always comes with an immense inward pressure. If you could bring this knowledge to proselytizers, like the people who go from door to door with their watchtowers, that there is going to be no conversion except if there is a really powerful inward pressure, it would certainly save them a lot of shoe leather. So, we want to look a little bit at conversion phenomena. Each of us, if we look at it in the deepest reality possible, each of us is really a focus of the universal spirit. And each of us is self-conscious. Maybe not really self-conscious of the universal nature of our waking being, and maybe not completely conscious about everything that's taking place in the world. But we are awake and we are self-conscious foci. This awakening, which is still continuing, is the product of an enormously long evolutionary process. In this process, the universal spirit, working collectively first and individually more later on, has developed a personality. And that personality is very small, very complex, and it is the focus of a waking spiritual individuality which reflects from the experiences of that personality. So it's a long, slow process of a universal consciousness becoming more and more focused through the development of a sequence of somatic experiences, different types of bodies, different conditions of reality in the external world, and through that interaction developing a selfhood, an individuality that wakes up through the experience of a very definite personality. So it's a long, long process. The personality, for all of its complexity, is still a very definite thing. It's a final thing. And it is through the personality that, and the limits of the personality, that the universal consciousness wakes up. And that a self knows its own being through those kinds of limitations. So, the universal spirit is itself universal. It is within everything, it is behind everything, and it works through everything and interpenetrates everything. So the universal spirit, as pure spirit, is capable of being in everything and being in anything. Now that's true in general. However, the individuality, which is close to the personality, even though it is a focus for that universality, it has a lot invested in the personality. And there is a two-way symbiosis between the individuality and the personality. And so there's an integrity of being between our spiritual state and our body state. And there is an integrity that is maintained more from the universal spirit because of its vantage that compensates for the needs of the personality. As we all know, the personality seems to have somewhat run amok. It sort of takes off on its own and does its own thing. Now this compensatory tension or integrity between individuality and personality is both material and spiritual. So that we can exist completely outwardly, we have gendered physical bodies. And those gendered physical bodies working in cooperation with other gendered physical bodies reproduce. This way, only part of the energy is used for reproduction, and the rest can be put into the evolution of consciousness, creating the individuality and becoming creators in general. The gendered physical body is itself complemented on the next level in that the etheric body, the vital body, has the opposite polarization, the opposite gender of the physical body. So there is a compensation that for our extreme statement of gendered existence in an outward-only world, in the soul nature, directed by the individuality, there is a compensatory flip of polarization. This kind of compensation is found throughout the entire character. In general, the spiritual individuality does complement the personality. It can do that because the individuality is part of something that's universal, and it has at its command, it has everything in the entire universe, whereas the personality has nothing but limitation, you might say. And so it is a dynamic process that takes place between the personality and the individuality. We know it to some extent as an argument, the dynamic interaction, because the personality does not always, in fact, it usually tries to be independent of the individuality, and it goes off and does its own thing, and under guidance and direction from the Spirit, which is always subtle and not overly commanding, it argues, and so we have that kind of an internal fight. But the Spirit still complements. It still fulfills the needs. So when the personality goes too far in a given direction, then working from within, the individuality builds up an enormous psychic force which complements so that the integrity of the character can be maintained and we don't go off on a really destructive tangent. So a cynical or a skeptical materialism is just that kind of dangerous extreme. And it requires a radical compensation. And that is the kind of condition that a conversion phenomenon occurs under. We may not like Cassius. We may not like his money-grubbing deeds any more than we like Saul of Tarsus for stoning Christians, innocent Christians that were harmless. But the universal spirit does love both of those personalities. And out of that love, it provides them with a conversion experience. Conversion experiences never happen in moderate people. Never. They only occur when there is extremity, because extremity is when that sort of thing is called for. So, while what's happening with Cassius is, he's concerned about the alliance, and he's concerned about being hooked up with Brutus, who he absolutely needs, because Brutus is such an idealist and he can't make any sound judgments in the world, but yet he's the popular guy and he's got to go along with him. And so what's happening is Cassius is also inwardly aware of the fact that this might be his last conscious day forever and ever and ever. So there's enormous pressure building up. And what's happening is flowing in from the Spirit is an extremely lucid stream of consciousness. The individuality is waxing up very strongly to meet the issue. And Cassius, who is already a very sharp observer, very sagacious, very keen on the material world, now with this extra oomph of spiritual consciousness coming from the individuality, when he looks at things, he sees more than he ever did before. The specific perceptions of Cassius then become touchstones for a limpid understanding from the universal spirit. And so there's a conversion. A conversion through compensatory application of the universal spirit for the universal spirit through the individuality. Not all conversions have the same degree of abruptness, and not all of them are as dramatic, for example, as Paul's. The scale of activity, the depth and profundity of the conversion varies from individual to individual. But they are all similar in that there is this application. The Spirit recognizes that this is a time that it must take care of its personality, even though that personality would brutishly pull away and do its own thing. So what we're finding in our little tragedy here is that there is something that is going beyond the personalities of the individuals, and we're finding that there are several tragic heroes. Because tragic heroes are people who make mistakes and realize their mistakes, and in the grief of realization of the enormity of their deeds, there is an awakening, and that awakening at least opens the door for improvement and for forward development. And that's happening to Cassius, who we never would have expected that it would have happened at all. It's a mild conversion, but it is something. Cassius is probably not going to be a saint. Not all conversion phenomena result in saints, but he's taken a step forward. It may take a number of dramatic steps, or it may take just one step like this and a whole lot of slow effort to wake up before there is a full awakening or there is something like a full sainthood. But this is something that is an irreversible step, though we're going to see there's always a little vacillation even after something like this has happened. So, this brings us to consider one more thing. That is one passage in 2 hours of talk. And that is, we want to look at the psychological mostly, but the spiritual phenomenon of omens. We've done that before, but we haven't done it very thoroughly, and we really don't know what's going on in the world of omenology. Primitive humans did and do consider spiritual power and the control of their lives to be outside, to be in things, and that an omenological experience is such because the object of the omen is potent. It is a totem object. The primitives saw power in things that could control them and change their lives. Now, I don't want to talk about primitives because all of us have primitivity in ourselves. I'm sure we've all heard the thing in folk language when talking about what's going to happen. People talk about the powers that be, is the way it goes in folk language. They always talk about the powers that be, which is a very unusual grammatical structure. To use the infinitive being, or to be, rather than saying that the powers that are, they're saying the powers that be, which makes them almost like nouns, which makes them like things, which is a totem statement. So when you hear people say, oh, the powers that be will determine that, it's like a capitulation to an omenological type of consciousness. In any case, the primitivity, whether it is in ourselves or in primitive people, it has to do with the understanding the wants of powers outside, and the best that we can do is to propitiate them. Sometimes omenological people, primitive people, try to manipulate one power against another, though there's never any definite assurance about that. It's almost like a child playing with blocks. Now this sounds to us very, very primitive, because we're self-conscious and we have a good deal of pride, ego in our self-consciousness. And we look at a view like this as offensive. I don't think we can really throw it out. Because if we look at it, this is what is behind herbalism. We say this herb has this power to change this in us. And if we were really as all-powerful as we think we are in our consciousness, we wouldn't need the herb. In fact, the philosophy, for example, of herbalism goes even further. And it even says that in the seasons that the herbs come into being has to do with the character of the herb itself and the kind of physical conditions that are present in that season. Like when we're making the changes in spring as we're making, there's a tendency to overcompensate, and there are more tendencies to fever in springtime. But that's the time. I was out today and I saw my first violets today. Aries is the sign of fevers, and violets are a febrifuge. And they come out at the time that they need to be there. So this is a statement that even to us, that there really is power in things outside of us. In fact, to a large extent, I think it might be overcompensation our belief in our ego strength, which is probably pretty feeble right now, and it's overcompensation that we place as much on it that we do. Even a lot of astrology is based on this same philosophy, that there are powers outside of us rather than things inside of us. At the other extreme, Sigmund Freud felt that omens, or that the powers of omens, had nothing to do with objects outside of us. He thought that omens occurred because of an internal psychological determinism. And that determinism was every bit as strict and as strong as a mechanical external determinism. The idea that the world is a machine and that we're just moved around as the machine is going. Freud felt that as pressure built up in the psyche, and it was directed with a given bent, with a given intent, what it reached the point where it made itself known, and it did so forcefully and decisively by bringing to consciousness external events in such a way that what was required in the unconsciousness, what was required by the unconscious, was seen in the event outside. And it could be almost any event that the individual took as an omen. And so that the prophecy or the prophetic nature of omens has not so much to do with things outside of us, but of a process of a power from within and an intelligence within the unconscious that is trying to accomplish something, and it knows where it's going and what it wants, and nothing will stand in its way, and that's where the prophecy comes from and not from any object outside. So the object was not, the omen was not empowered by something outside, but something inside. The intent that comes from the unconscious may have even been sown in consciousness. It may be very well known that we wanted this all along and that we built up our desires or our wishes more and more all the time. This view is not completely offensive to spiritual thinking, because behind even the personal unconscious, there is the universal spirit, which forces the personal unconscious to do its bidding, to answer to its will. This is what Freudian slips are. You say what you never ever would have said in a Freudian slip, because the spirit wants the personal unconscious, that ego nature, to be exposed. And like it or not, it gets exposed. Now, this view of omens has some objectionable things about it. We don't have time to go into them. It's like a lot of Sigmund Freud's ideas. Sigmund Freud created little islands in consciousness. He didn't carry them out to the extent of the universal spirit, but in those little islands, everything was complete. You can't, everything was, it's such a clear view. There was a science fiction film about 15 years ago, maybe a little longer than that, from Russia. It was called Solaris, about these people that get out there. Do you see it's, and what they got involved with this planet, and what this planet did, it was all the planet was an intelligent consciousness, and it reflected back to them their own memories, and they were captured in little islands of their own memories, in their own being within this greater consciousness. And that's what reading Sigmund Freud is like. However, because some universal understanding does stream into those islands and is part of their design, you can't discard it. I have to say that Sigmund Freud's view of omens has applied in my own life. I can remember one time I was living in a retreat in Southern California, and I had been there for several years. And one day I was walking along, and I saw a crow that apparently had robbed some bird's nest, and a whole bunch of about 5 or 6 other birds were chasing that crow, and they were trying to get it and wanting it to drop the bird or whatever. And I looked at it, and immediately when I looked at it, I knew I was going out into a wider world than the little retreat center that I was living in, and that was it. And from there on in, it was very prophetic. From there on in, my whole consciousness changed. It's like I had been incubating in that kind of consciousness for a while, and that was over. Now, I've seen this phenomenon before then, and I've seen it many times since then. A bunch of little birds chasing a big bird, and on no other occasion has it been omenological for me. Because I hadn't built up that kind of need, or the inner awareness in me hadn't caused the pressure to see the external event as an omen. So, again, we can't completely subscribe to this view of omens any more than we can completely subscribe to the primitive view, but there is something true about it. If we can get the gist of this all together, if we realize that what we feed into our soul nature, what our thoughts are, what our feelings are, and what we are constantly seeding in there, our character changes. And what our character is what our destiny becomes. Like when we're drawn out to meet such and such kind of person or to be involved in such and such movement, that isn't because that's happening outside. It's because our character is such that we draw ourselves to that external activity, or we activate that external activity from ourselves. We'll get back to Shakespeare before the night is over. Carl Jung was something of an indecisive fence-sitter on the matter of omens. Partially because he wanted to avoid mysticism at all costs. He wrote this and he said this. He wanted to avoid mysticism at all costs because he wanted analytical psychology to be put on the same footing. He wanted it to be a peer with the physical sciences. And so what he did is he postulated 2 parallel universes. One conscious and outward, and one inward and unconscious. And that they ran parallel in time and space. They were so parallel to him that it was almost a point-for-point agreement. And when an important event occurred in one realm, it also occurred in the other realm. And if there was an awakening of consciousness as a consequence of a significant coincident event between the 2 realms, that was in effect an omen. He mentions a very famous case where he was working with a woman for months and months, bringing her to an awareness of her soul nature, and at the very moment there was an epiphany of consciousness in her, and she understood her soul and knew that she had a soul. At that very moment, a moth appeared at the window, and that moth was the symbol of the soul. In fact, it was called psyche by the Greeks. And so he said that he cites this as the perfect example. However, because he did not want to be involved with mysticism, he was adamant about calling it synchronicity and a causal principle. And he goes so far as to state literally that there is no causality between the 2 worlds, because if there were, causality between the two worlds, there would be magic, and we all know there is no magic. So we're dealing with a mentality that didn't believe in meditation, and a mind that argued with Brahmin priests in India that there was no consciousness beyond the self, all because he had a lot invested in what he was trying to leave to the world. Nonetheless, we can't discard this idea either, because in fact, there are parallels between the different realms and the different planes of consciousness. They aren't completely point for point, because the higher we go in the spiritual worlds, the more each of those worlds has a life unto its own, and only a certain small percentage is directed to the lower worlds. But it is true that there is a reality of parallel worlds. Jung himself was tacit about it, but he certainly believed that he caused changes in his life, and that many of those changes came from within his own being. And so he was in a position that was similar to the position of David Hume, of having postulated a philosophy that was logically beautiful, but that he couldn't live by, because he still had to believe that he was capable of causation. So, what we have run into with Shakespeare and the play, the way it is handled by Shakespeare, it's not just a history. It's listed by Shakespeare himself as a tragedy. So Shakespeare is demonstrating that within the protagonists of the play, there is a parallelism that is taking place in their lives, and that parallelism has to do with the course of history of Rome itself, and now through the use of omens, it has to do with the whole relationship of nature as the outward, total, external expression of the universal spirit. And so it's really quite ingenious the way these things are brought in these things. Mysticism claims that we're capable of consciousness in two directions of manifest being, and that we are causally affected in both directions. That is, the spirit can will and intend changes, and through a causal stream beginning with thoughts, it can cause changes in the external world. Events in the external world, whether they be so-called dumb experiences of nature, or whether they be caused by other people or other creative free agencies in the process, those events can impress themselves on us, and we are affected, and it's carried into our very being. So, in the outer world, the world of particulars, it is clear that we are participating both perceptually and causally. When we are in tune with our own nature, it isn't so much important always what particular kind of practices we utilize to expand and awaken our consciousness and to produce a stronger unity all the way from the universal spirit to the physical part of the personality. But when we do these exercises to attune ourselves to the entire gestalt of our being and to participate fully, something else happens. We get a feeling that even though we're functioning in our little petty world of our own making, we have an inward feeling that God is in its heaven and all is well. And that feeling is impersonal and selfless. With that realization, we feel we could even undergo great personal harm and feel that it would be all right because everything was in its place and everything is all right. Carl Jung? So Carl Jung may have been incorrect in saying that we couldn't be conscious of what is called the psychological unconscious, or that we couldn't be conscious of the realm beyond self. But if we take him to say that we can't be conscious of those things in the same way that we're conscious of an ant going over our foot, he was correct. Because the kind of consciousness that we have that relates to realms beyond self, and the kind of consciousness that apperceives the entirety of our psychological process, much of which is unconscious to us now, is a totally different quality of consciousness. And if we wake up to spiritual understanding, we will not drive our lives the way we drive a car, pointing and aiming it. It will be that it will be more a direction that is like the consciousness of God is in its heaven and all is well. It is more like a total, universal, spiritual consciousness, that thing that manifests things or does things within itself and within the goodness or within the beingness of that higher, more general consciousness, that things of a more creative nature and of a more universal nature are accomplished. Is it too hot in here? Okay. Because I know a lot of people are saying this is getting way too long. And it probably is. So, we have to understand that the kind of consciousness that is ours most of the time now is like one of Freud's little islands. And that whether we know it or not, we are changing destiny with that more indirect control, that more universal control that works throughout everything, and it wills or it impels things within itself with that kind of causality. So, that Cassius is really transformed, or that he has really converted, is seen very much in his next speech, where he says, "Now, most noble Brutus, the gods today stand friendly, that we may, lovers in peace, lead on our days to age. But since the affairs of men rests still uncertain, let's reason with the worst that may befall. If we do lose this battle, then is this the very last time we shall speak together. But what are you determined to do?" So he's become something of a benign individual. Brutus, on the other hand, hasn't changed. His next speech indicates even though he has questions about Stoicism, he's still Stoic. "Even by the rule of that philosophy by which I did blame Cato for the death with which he did give himself, I know not how, but I do find it cowardly and vile for fear of what might befall, so to prevent the time of life, arming myself with patience to stay the providence of some high powers that govern us below." And then Cassius asks him, well, are you ready to be paraded through Rome if you lose? And Brutus says, no, Cassius, no. Think not thou, noble Roman, that ever Brutus will go bound to Rome. He bears too great a mind. But this same day must end that work the Ides of March begun. And whether we shall ever meet again, I know not. Therefore our everlasting farewell take. Forever and forever farewell, Cassius. If we do meet again, why we shall smile. If not, why then this parting was well made. So he's the same Brutus. Cassius has been converted or transformed in that he looks at things differently now. But Brutus is still back and forth. He's still waging the battle in his mind with his own mind. On one hand, he doesn't like the Stoics and their suicide, but on the other hand, he doesn't want to be humble and be paraded through the streets of Rome as a captive, where he was once one of the most honored men of the entire city. After this fruitful period in the play, that is fruitful of perception and reflection and more inward experience, the compensation again shifts outward, and it shifts to that horrible circumstance of war. And things become very difficult from here on in. The second scene is very brief. In that scene, Brutus demands that the alarm be sounded and that the battle proceed, and he directs his armies to charge on the wing of Octavius. That's the entirety of the scene. In scene 3, it occurs in another part of the battlefield, and Cassius, who has attracted to himself in his former time a number of people who are into taking bribes, and not all men of high character, people who are on the take. He learns a very bitter lesson, because he himself looked only for himself in his own pecuniary enrichment. He has attracted to himself people who are likewise selfish, and they're cowards. And some of his men run away from him, and he's so angry that he even slays one of his own men. Because he has undergone a conversion doesn't necessarily mean that his men have undergone a conversion. And it doesn't mean that he has abrogated the consequence of all of his previous actions, the previous causes that he put into effect. That's conversion just means that the direction has changed. None of the destiny is. Paul, who underwent a real severe, very radical conversion involving blindness and spiritual levels of awakening of a very deep state, had a devastating destiny after his conversion. He was poor. He was an outcast from the Jews, where he had previously been a leader, and he was never completely trusted or accepted by the original apostles or disciples, even though they had dreams telling them that they must trust him. Peter had to follow behind him and make sure that he did everything right all the way through. So Paul had this kind of thing with him. He was there at the stoning of Stephen, and himself, he was stoned 3 times. He was left for dead. And he got to the point that he became indifferent about his own personal suffering, because all it did was draw him closer and closer to the Spirit, and he began to realize that when he was strong in himself, he was really weak in the Christ Spirit. But that when he was weak, that he had to throw everything into that universal Christ love, then he was strong in Christ. And he understood the purpose of it all. If we're self-centered, unpleasant consequences, when they come to us, we see them as bad luck. Or we blame other people for them, not realizing that we're really the origin of them. If we've undergone some kind of awakening on a higher level, some kind of conversion, we see the events that happen to us in different eyes. We learn to accept everything that occurs to us as just, as something that is due to us, and something that is to our betterment. And even if it were unjust, because it is possible for there to be unjust things as long as there are creative people and creative free agents can throw in totally unjust causes, even if something unjust is directed toward us, we consider that an honor. We consider it an opportunity to take into us something that would normally be malignant and turn it into something positive. So we begin to see our bad luck as opportunities for creation. Cassius' problems continue to mount. Tinnitus, his general, reports that Brutus has been peremptory, and he has routed the forces of Octavius, and he has allowed them to loot too early. And consequently, because they're in their looting, which was common in battle, this is why people went to war, the hope of looting other people, because he allowed them to loot too soon, they weren't able to come to the aid of the armies of Cassius, which were now surrounded by the forces of Antony. Cassius then sees fire down near his tents. He's in a high land, and he gives his horse to Tinnitus and says, go down there and see whether they're friend or foe. And while Tinnitus is riding down there, Cassius has his slave Pindarus go to the top of the hill and watch from above, and he tells Cassius that Tinnitus is surrounded and people are overjoyed at surrounding him. Cassius interprets this to mean that he has just thrown away his best friend and his chief general Tinnitus, and he tells Pindarus, you're free if you'll hold my sword while I run on it and kill myself. And he does so, and shouting as he runs on his own sword to Caesar that Caesar is avenged. And that is the end of Cassius. After he dies, the now freed Pindarus runs off, and he vows never to again to set eyes on a Roman. He doesn't want to live in any republic where people are that harsh with each other. At that moment, Tinnitus and Messala enter, discussing how Brutus and Antony have won, and how Octavius and Cassius have lost. And they discover the body of Cassius. And they recognize that with their primary general gone, their day is done. And they discuss the glum attitude of Cassius to have in despair or in pessimism to have killed himself. There's a very lovely statement by Masala at line 66. Anybody want to read it? It begins, mistrust. Paul, you want to read? Mistrust of good success.
Mistrust of good success has done this deed. O hateful error, melancholy child, why dost thou show to the apt thoughts of men the things that are not? O error soon conceived, that never comes to a happy birth, kills the mother that engendered thee.
A rather heavy statement about a heavy subject. At this moment, Brutus and his people enter and they find the bodies. Masala, after he says that, goes to fetch Brutus. And while he's gone, Tinnitus muses about how Cassius has mistaken everything, and he was seeing a celebration as the celebration of the enemy rather than the celebration of his own men. And what he does is he takes the sword of Cassius and he kills himself. And immediately thereafter Brutus and his retinue enter, and they find all the bodies. And Brutus mourns for Cassius. He mourns for all of them, but especially for Cassius. And then he says, but you won't see any tears from me. If I do have tears, it will be later. And he commands, get the bodies out of here, because they'll only dishearten the soldiers. This is a side of Brutus that we haven't seen before, just like we didn't see the side of Cassius before. There's really a lot of character elaboration in very short little things. At first look, it looks like Brutus is made of some pretty stern stuff. He's not cracked at the realization of the enormity of his deed in assassinating his own friend. And he's not cracked at the death of his friend and brother-in-law, Cassius. And he didn't really crack when Portia died. He sheds no tears for his own brother-in-law. But this is not because Brutus is hard. Psychologically, and to some extent physically, hardness is a consequence of indulgence. Every time we indulge ourselves in desire, even good desires, we indulge ourselves in having helped someone, we harden our character a little more. Merely satisfying a desire isn't indulgent unless that desire happens to be vain and unnecessary. It is the egoistic or the personal reveling in the satisfaction of a desire that is indulgent. It is possible to have normal everyday motivations that are healthy and satisfy them without becoming hard. Moreover, if we ignore our conscience and the intuition within it, we amplify the hardening process. That kind of behavior does not describe Brutus. He's not hard. So we have to look somewhere else to understand his behavior. It looks, at least to me, it looks like it's because of his mental disposition. He's always thinking about things, that because he's so much in his mind that he becomes removed from a proper interpretation of his perceptions. He becomes removed from his feelings and emotions, and his mind can't even be penetrated by intuition. Cassius, until his conversion, interpreted the world in very material, worldly terms, in gains and advantages in personal ways. Brutus interprets the world not in its own values, but according to his thoughts. He's always weighing and measuring the world according to his ideals and philosophy. And the word his is important. It would be healthy if the ideals were something that transcended personal values, something like Platonic ideas, or the ideas that were behind all of the Neoplatonists. It would then be all right to understand the transactions of the material world in the basis of those higher spiritual things. But he has personal values, and that's why there is all of that uncertainty. It's likely that the stress of all of the events, especially having murdered your best friend, have caused him to withdraw. And he has withdrawn even more into his idealism, because that is his habitual state of soul, is to go into his mental idealism. Challenge often does that, especially with people who are masochistic. People who are masochistic, the more they're challenged, the more they put themselves in the way of challenge, and they dig in even more. We know that from arguments. When we get set in our way of thinking, we don't think it all out. And if somebody challenges us, we think that we personally are challenged and that we sink into ourselves. It's possible for a mental idealist that such an one can be completely removed from experience, from the horrible things that are going on. Because Brutus still hasn't really waked up yet to the killing of his friend. Even if he's part of it all, he's so much removed. Now, there's a really funny thing about this, because from a God's eye point of view, he might be right. And he might be interpreting things according to something that is some true ideal. But that's not what his experience is. From the God's eye point of view, the universal spirit does see things in a much broader sense. Whereas the Bible says God is not a respecter of persons. It sees things with a much grander purpose. But it isn't removed, because the Spirit is very, very sensitive. And it doesn't have that same kind of ego trap. And so as a consequence, the Spirit can feel with enormous sensitivity everything that is going on without the kind of withdrawal that Brutus is having. So the abstract mental idealist is capable of horrendous actions in the service of a system. We know that from people like Stalin and people like that. They weren't necessarily selfish monsters. Mao Zedong killed millions and millions of people for the sake of a system. This is a withdrawal into a mental abstraction and being out of touch with what you're doing. You know, it's a tough thing. The reason I'm so vehement about this is because I'm the type of person that gets involved with mental abstraction to the point of almost being inhuman at some times. The behavior of Cassius in this scene until his death is also difficult to decipher. I mean to say, about all of these interpretations of the psychology and the spiritual activity that's going on, there are a lot of other interpretations that could be put forward, even by me. And if some of you would like to offer other interpretations and other outlooks on what we're going into, I would be very glad to listen, and I'll even sit down. I'll give you the microphone and everything, or not if you don't want to. And I find something like this very engaging, and it would be nice to have more going on. But at any rate, the behavior of Cassius is ambiguous, and it's open to several interpretations. However, the inconsistency of Cassius seems to me logical or psychological and even expectable. Cassius. We're done with Buddhists for the time being until next time around. Normally, one would expect somebody that was a materialistic skeptic, somebody that was very sagacious, you would expect him to say, I have to see for myself. You wouldn't expect him to send a slave to the top of the hill. He'd go up to the top of the hill himself and say, I have to see for myself. I can't trust somebody else to see. That's the kind of personality that Cassius normally is. And then he would go to the vantage point and he would look, and he would look as though his life depended on it. However, Cassius is not in a normal state. He has experienced a minor conversion phenomenon. And when that happens, I just underwent a minor conversion phenomenon in the last year and a half. I retired. And I vacillated back and forth about who and what I was. Was I my dreams in the future, or was I all of that I was doing all the time? And there's a lot of inconsistency. You know, it's sort of like if you're going from one horse to another horse on the run. And that's a very trepidatious place. And you go back and forth. And the old Cassius certainly would have seen for himself, and he would have interpreted for himself. However, what the new Cassius is, that isn't clear yet. The dust hasn't settled, and there hasn't been a statement or an assertion of what the new Cassius is. Now, in something like this, it's possible to interpret Cassius' actions and point the finger at him and say, to thine own self be true. You know, like hie thee up the hill and take a look for yourself. But that's exactly what he has been doing. Even more than Brutus, he's been being true to himself. And he's been calling it the way he's called it, and that's what led to the conversion experience, because he was true to himself. Apparently, the conversion experience was sufficient to him, at least enough for him to believe in omens and not merely to look at dry facts. But it didn't go much further yet. It takes a long time for a character to change. Even if there are sudden moments of conversion, the character still has to go through a lot of work. So, he's in a crisis, and in this crisis he reverts to his old ways. Materialism and skepticism do not necessarily mean pessimism, but rarely do you ever find pessimism missing from that combination. At least in my experience, it's almost never. And I think this is true for other people too. Because if you look back into history, if you look at the four temperaments, the temperament that is associated with earthiness and detail and such is in fact called the melancholic temperament. Even astrologically, the earth signs and the seriousness of them are said to be fearful signs. There's a morbid concern about health. And in cosmological astrology, the mineral world itself is ruled by Saturn. And we went through our mineral-like condition in that ancient Saturn period. So this condition of melancholy that accompanies materialism and skepticism seems in part due to the fact that such a personality is attached to things. And when it's attached to things, it invests itself and its own psychic energy in those things. We saw last time we talked that Cassius took hurt when Brutus criticized him of selling favors, taking bribes. He took that personally because that was where his value was. And so a lot of what would normally invigorate the soul nature is spent and attached to material things. And as a consequence, the energy does become melancholic, or it depends on the state of the world. Moreover, if our attention is directed to material things, we are closed. This is a closed system. Cassius is coming from a state where he thinks there is nothing else but the material world. Everything's going to die. And as a consequence, there is a closedness that the spirit cannot penetrate. And there cannot be refreshment, and there cannot be spiritual invigoration. And as a result of that, there is that melancholy. This is exactly what one suspects. So we see that the flaws that are fatal flaws in the character of Brutus and Cassius are at opposite extremes. Brutus is abstracted or withdrawn into a mental state, and in that mental state he keeps tossing things back and forth, and he doesn't judge facts correctly, and he doesn't accept intuitions. Cassius, on the other hand, his fatal flaw was to be at the other end of the spirit-matter pole. He was locked up all in matter and did not allow the spirit to penetrate and come through so that he could be enlightened. So even though Cassius got as far as being able to see the supernatural in omens, he certainly didn't get far enough so that he got beyond his personal philosophy, and when he reverted to his personal philosophy, it was his undoing. Very often, the things that we hold most dear to us, because we hold them dear to us, and put our stake in them rather than in the universal spirit, those are the very things that are our demise. So the statements of Masala are as poetically true and beautiful as they are grim. Pessimism is self-defeating, and it has an auto-destructive character to it. And that's the way with all imperfect or specialized philosophies. Now, it's easy for us to speak from without, but each of us carries our own death with us. And each of us lock ourselves into something that is not of the immortal life of the universal spirit. And until we can thoroughly bring that through, the egoism and the attachment or wherever we hang along the way is going to be the source of our self-destruction. Masala is like the world and doesn't see any future hope. And perhaps he and the world miss these things altogether. Next time we'll finish up the play. Can't possibly not finish it up. And we'll not do quite so much psychology next time and not so much philosophy, but we'll try to get onto our spiritual theme because there's an awful lot of that. And if in the 2 weeks' time, if any of you have ideas of interpreting these characters different and would like to present them or give them to me to present, I would love it. I'm all open to all of that. Thank you very much. Don't forget, we're getting in touch with Paul and whatever you got.